Last week on the program, we talked about the province's latest update on Ontario's poverty reduction strategy. Well, it got us thinking about our efforts to help the poorest people in this country. There are those who say a guaranteed minimum income is the answer. Well, it might surprise you to learn that in one Canadian town, that's already been tried. Between 1974 and 1978, a government experiment granted people in Dauphin, Manitoba, a minimum income, or a minicum. Once it ended, the experiment, well, then was quickly forgotten. But a professor at the University of Manitoba has dug up the data and talks about its success. Evelyn Forget is on the line this morning. Evelyn Forget, good morning.
Good morning, Lisa.
So what happened back in Dauphin in the 1970s?
Well, it was a wonderful experiment. It was a time when a lot of social programs were being rethought in Canada, and the idea at the beginning of the 70s was that by the end of the decade, this would be rolled out generally across the country. So this was seen not only as an experiment, but also as a pilot project for something that they thought would be introduced.
So how did it work?
In Dauphin was a saturation site, and that meant that everybody in town who qualified, that is, whose income was low enough, was guaranteed a supplement under this scheme. If they received no income from any other source, they would receive a payment about equal to what they would get under the existing social assistance scheme, so about equal to the welfare payment at the time. The interesting thing about Mincome, though, was that it was also available to the working poor, people who had low-paying jobs or insecure jobs. As their income from other sources increased, their benefits were reduced, but they didn't disappear entirely. So there were a lot of supplements that went out to people who were working as well. And what that meant was that families had a sort of an insurance policy. They knew that they would be guaranteed at least a certain amount of money.
And it was more than they would have collected, for example, on social assistance? Or
Well, not if they weren't working. It was about the same.
Okay.
Probably a few dollars more. The people who really benefited, though, were the people who didn't qualify for welfare, either because they were working or they were self-employed. There were a lot of farming families, for example. And those were the people who benefited. The easiest way to think about it, it's very much like a refundable tax credit, like the National Child Benefit. So that if you receive no income at all, you get a certain fixed amount. As your income increases, the benefit's reduced, but it's reduced by less than $1 for $1.
So what impact did it have on people's lives?
I guess from my perspective, there were two big impacts. The first thing I found was that a whole lot more kids stayed in high school. The high school completion rate increased during the period of the experiment. Mm-hmm. And the second big impact, I managed to look at the Manitoba health data, and I found an 8.5% reduction in hospitalizations for people who participated in the experiment.
You're kidding.
Now that's a huge effect.
I mean,
that's a much larger effect than anybody expected. I mean, we always know that poor health is a consequence of poverty. Poor people tend to have poorer health than people who have more money, more income. But we had no idea that the effect would be that large.
And I mean, like, if you're looking at 8.5, I mean, that's a huge amount of money.
That's a huge impact. If you think of Canada's currently spending over $50 billion a year on hospitals, so an 8.5% reduction is $4 billion.
So what about the effects on the labor market?
Yeah, that was actually the purpose of Mincome. The fear at the time was that if you introduce a guaranteed annual income, a lot of people would quit their jobs and collect assistance. Well, it turned out that if you were a grown-up with a real job, most people don't quit real jobs in order to live at the welfare rate. So, I mean, that didn't happen. But there were two groups of people who did reduce the number of hours they worked, and they reduced them in really interesting ways. If you think back to the 1970s, maternity leaves were about 6 weeks. Married women tended to use the guaranteed income to buy themselves longer maternity leave. So if they were leaving the workforce anyway to have a baby, they stayed out of the workforce a little bit longer. And the other group who had a very large impact were adolescents, and in particular, adolescent boys. And what happened was that they were taking their first full-time job at a later age. They were staying in high school just a little bit longer, which I think is a positive effect rather than a negative one.
Why was it dropped?
Well, the 70s were sort of a difficult time economically. There were a couple of oil price shocks, and interest rates spiked to about 18%. Inflation was, running at about 10% a year. And that caused difficulty for governments both at the federal and at the provincial level. Provincially, Manitoba had its first ever NDP government, and that government fell in '76. And federally, the Trudeau Liberals fell in '79. And the new governments, I think, were focused on other economic issues, and poverty sort of was put on the back burner.
So what sparked your interest in this?
Well, I guess I'm a health economist. My real academic concern is the costs of delivering the healthcare system. And I spend a lot of time in a downtown hospital in Winnipeg, and you don't have to spend very long in the halls of the hospital to realize that a lot of what you're treating are the consequences of poverty. And that happens in a lot of areas. I mean, if you look at child and family services, if you look at criminal justice, if you look at any of our social programs, what we're treating are the consequences of poverty. So it seems reasonable to look at better ways to deliver social assistance, and that really was my first concern.
Because I wonder about the present day potential for something like this.
Yeah. I think it's an idea that comes back on a fairly regular basis. I mean, I think we have moved towards some of the ideas that are embodied in guaranteed annual income since the 1970s. I mentioned the National Child Benefit, which is, in effect, a guaranteed income for certain families. It's quite small, but, I mean, it exists. The guaranteed income supplement for seniors is another form of guaranteed income. So there are portions of the population who already benefit from guaranteed annual income-like schemes. And I think inevitably we will move towards this sort of a scheme as we rethink how we deliver social assistance. But there's a great deal of political resistance.
Evelyn Forget, it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Evelyn Forget is professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. What do you think about this? Minimum income. Do you think there should be such a thing in Canada? You can put your thoughts on our Facebook page. We already have a link there to this, and we've been asking you to comment about this. And it's interesting tracking down Evelyn and finding out what she has to say about it. But again, go to CBC Superior Morning, and we've got a link to this article. We already have a couple of comments there. Caesar Squiddy says a guaranteed family income, a top-up of sorts, seems logical. And Sharon K. Nyman says, I think sometimes blame is misplaced. Sometimes it isn't. I think it would be better to guarantee jobs for everyone instead. So it's interesting to hear what you've got to say about this. Again, CBC Superior Morning.